Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dr. Mike Bell, the Executive Director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the National World War II Museum. We're delighted to continue bringing you this amazing content as part of our conference, Memory Wars, World War II at 75 and Beyond. This program is possible due to the generous support of our sponsors, the American Battle Monuments Commission and EA, Respawn Entertainment, and Oculus by Meta. Thank you for joining us for this important and extremely timely session looking at life and death between Hitler and Stalin, mass murder and memory in Eastern Europe. When putting this program together, we wanted to stress the importance and relevance of the Second World War to today, and anyone paying attention to the news, certainly over the last month, knows that the memory of war is alive. For this session, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce one of our comrades in the Jenny Craig Institute, Chair Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2013 and has taught world history and European history at Pearl River Community College, the University of Chicago, and the University of Southern Mississippi, and the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. Jason joined the National World War II Museum in September 2017 as our Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency Special Projects Historian, and he investigated what happened to hundreds of American POWs in German captivity, whose remains were never recovered. Since January 2019, Jason's worked in the Jenny Craig Institute as a research historian. In the Institute, he examines the service records of World War II veterans, authors of biographies for family members, and regularly contributes to the museum's website and public programming on subjects such as the anti-Nazi resistance, the Holocaust, and the lives and careers of scholars who shaped our understanding of World War II. Jason co-edited a work on the life and work of Günter Andres and is the author of several articles and book chapters on the philosophical and political thought of Günter Andres. So it's my distinct pleasure to turn it over to our chair for this session, Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason, the floor is yours.
Mike, thanks very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to extend my welcome as well. Thanks for joining us on this third and concluding day of our Memory Wars conference. I have the distinct pleasure of chairing this very important and, as Mike said, timely session on life and death between Hitler and Stalin, mass murder and memory in Eastern Europe, and have two outstanding scholars, experts on this area. Both have spent considerable time there and will have a lot to say to us today about the memory of World War II in Eastern Europe coming right up to the present time. So I'm going to introduce them in the order they'll be presenting. And what we'll do is each one will have 10 to 12 minutes to present. And then I will come back and have roughly 20, 25 minutes of discussion with them, and then we'll open it up and hear from you with your questions. So first, Professor Alex Richie is Władysław Bartoszewski Chair at Collegium Civitas in Warsaw, Poland. She specializes in the history of Central and Eastern Europe in World War II and defense and security issues. She is the author of Faust's Metropolis, A History of Berlin, and an award-winning Warsaw 1944, Hitler, Himmler, and the Warsaw Uprising. I think many in our audience, Professor Richie, are very familiar with your book and obviously your appearances here at our international conferences. She is currently working on a book about the occupation of Poland by Hitler and Stalin, and she is a presidential counselor at the museum and frequently leads tours of European World War II historic sites for the museum, a long friendship with Professor Richie. Our second panelist is Professor Omer Bartov, who is the John P. Birkelund Distinguished Professor of European History and Professor of German Studies at Brown University. He is a graduate of Tel Aviv University and St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. He specializes in the indoctrination of the Nazi Wehrmacht and the crimes it committed during World War II, the links between war and genocide, and cultural representation. Here I'm just going to mention just a selection of his publications, including Germany's War and the Holocaust, Disputed Histories, The Jew in Cinema, Erased Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine, and Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called Buchach. He has just completed a new monograph tentatively titled Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Past, and has edited several volumes, including Voices on War and Genocide, 3 accounts of the world wars in a Galician town, and reflecting his new interest, the forthcoming Israel-Palestine lands and people. So, Alex and Omer, welcome. It's great to see you both.
Thank you.
And Alex, we will obviously begin with you. So you will begin 10 to 12 minutes, and then we'll hear from Omer and then come back for Q&A.
The area between Hitler and Stalin was the most vicious theater of warfare in Europe in World War II, an area that Tim Snyder refers to as the Bloodlands. In the West, there's a tendency to look at this history as a sort of clash of huge armies, Titanic, Barbarossa, 2 million troops, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, and so on. But what really makes this theater such a terrible theater of war was the involvement of the civilian population. We see it even now in Ukraine. From the beginning, Hitler's war was a war of annihilation. The Einsatzgruppen were first sent into Poland to decapitate the Polish intelligentsia, and of course they carried their murderous work on into Barbarossa, the Holocaust by bullets, and then of course additionally there were things like the creation of extermination camps like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Treblinka, which were specifically to do with the mass murder of civilians, and particularly of the Jews of the region. So why is this history so little known? One of the reasons, I think, is the complexity of the fighting, mixed loyalties, the sheer scale of the brutality, the criminality, the plethora of languages. This all led to a quagmire for historians trying to understand what happened in the region. And this was complicated even more by the fact that it fell behind the Iron Curtain. The Cold War came, it was very difficult to do research. And of course, Stalin had an official version of history, which, for example, did not include the Holocaust. And we see in, for example, Omer's incredible book, Anatomy of a Genocide, about the town of Buchach, how many different layers and how complex this area was. And it's very, very difficult to unpick this. Now, we're talking generally today about the region between Hitler and Stalin. And so I'm just going to race through quickly 2 examples. First, Germany. How is German historiography seen and how does it see the war? I'm going to be talking about this later on in the afternoon with regard to the Holocaust, so I'm going to really skip over this. But the only thing I'll say is that at least West Germany, the Federal Republic, had the good grace to find itself in the West. And although there was reluctance to talk about the war immediately afterwards, the questions of the 1968 generation, the Historikerstreit, things like the exhibition about the crimes against the Wehrmacht, the increasing interest in the Holocaust, have led to quite an extraordinary burst of interest in history in Germany. Poland fell, of course, behind the Iron Curtain. It also was sort of subjected to this official Soviet history written where so many things were written out. There was no Katyn massacre, for example. The Akal were sort of semi-criminals. The Holocaust was just, there were victims of fascism. There was a persistent underground historiography in Poland, both in the emigre community and within Poland itself. And so people did keep this history alive. But there were some things very much left out, which have only come to light more recently, things like Polish collaboration and so on. And the collapse of communism did lead to a wave of interest in history from all sorts of different perspectives, and also a lot of courage at examining the past, at least for a time. For example, exemplified by Jan Gross's book Neighbors, which examined a pogrom against Jews in July 1941, perpetrated by Poles against their Jewish neighbors. But after this, there was, again, an immense amount of interest and research, too, huge volumes that were published by the government and the encouragement of scholarship and inquiry until the 2015 electoral victory of the Law and Justice Party, Peace, which has been very, very interested in the recreation of a kind of Poland as the modern nation version of history, and is rather less inclined to finance historians who are interested in the slightly murkier and more difficult aspects of Polish history, to the extent that they've published a law prosecuting possibly historians who go against their sort of self-imposed regulations. So there's a lot of complexity, and Poland is representative of a number of countries in the region that are going in that direction. So what about the Soviet Union? Well, one has to remember that although Russia has rather co-opted the history of the Red Army, there were Ukrainians, Belarusians, and many, many others who fought in the Red Army as well. And this history has rather sort of been taken over by them. And so it's something that's very, very important to remember. And I know that we're going to talk in much more depth about Ukraine and about the role of Ukraine in Russian identity. I'm just going to talk very, very briefly about history and memory in World War II before passing over to Omer. So World War II in Russia has been weaponized. It's part of our memory war. And there are many, many examples of this. In August 2016, the new education minister, Olga Vasilyeva, who was a huge Stalin fan, took office, and history textbooks started changing very much because of this. So, for example, World War II, according to the Russian textbooks, did not begin with the invasion of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, followed by the Soviet invasion on the 17th of September 1939, but began with Barbarossa in 1941. And in most books, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is not mentioned at all, or if it is, it's called a non-aggression pact, an agreement which, as Putin shocked Angela Merkel in 2013 by saying that it made sense for ensuring the security of the Soviet Union. Starting the war in 1941 is quite convenient because the Russians don't have to teach how Stalin attacked Finland or annexed the Baltic states or took half of Poland, murdering Polish officers at Katyn. Instead, the invasion of Eastern Europe by Soviet troops is portrayed as a liberation. The portrayal of Stalin is equally one-sided. He's nothing less than the greatest war leader ever to have lived, and his crimes are really airbrushed out of history. And we know that we, as scholars, know that one reason that the Red Army was unprepared for Barbarossa was that he purged the army on the eve of the war. But this does not appear in the history books. History is used to bolster national pride, and it is political. And now, under Putin, anybody who disagrees with the official line is quite literally in mortal danger. Independent institutions which question it are labeled as foreign agents, undesirables. One example which I find particularly sad, having lived in Moscow for some time, is the demise of the great institution Memorial, which was a group which investigated Stalinist crimes. It had a huge collection of archive information and so on. Well, Putin's natural home is the KGB, whose legacy included the suppression of dissent. He's also been heavily influenced by Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of the Russian Security Council, who promotes this besieged fortress idea, which is so beloved of Putin. And Patrushev refers to the former KGB and successor FSB as the Russia's new nobility. So, as I said, this is all part of the memory war, and no more is it visible than the World War II. History is more visible than on Victory Day, when all of Moscow turns out and celebrates and glorifies the pride that Russians feel in their World War II experience. But Putin uses this in his efforts to rebuild Russian national pride following the shame and humiliation of the end of the Cold War. And there are other historical facts that are left out of bounds as well. Stalin's man-made famine, the Holodomor, which claimed 3 million lives in Ukraine, is still not recognized. And as I mentioned earlier, even the Katyn crimes, which were recognized by both Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin as having been perpetrated by the Soviets, are now being blamed once again on the Nazis. So, of course, the history of the region is enormously complex, and I'm sure we'll talk about Ukraine and what Putin is actually trying to do, and how he's using Ukrainian history for his own ends. Of course, the area is very complex. In places like Ukraine, nationalist insurgent groups did rise against during World War II and were caught between two genocidal totalitarian regimes, and some did welcome the Germans in 1941. Some Ukrainians committed horrific acts of violence, particularly against the Jewish population. And since the fall of the USSR, some of these insurgent fighters are indeed recognized as heroes and it inspired things like the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. But in reality, the ultra-right is a tiny percentage of the population, and Putin still latches onto them, calling them, fascists. He says he wants to denazify Ukraine, and he says that the purpose of this operation, as he calls it, is to protect people who for 8 years have been facing humiliation and genocide perpetrated by the Kyiv regime. So he wants to sort of demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. The West, in particular the United States, he says, have supported this neo-Nazism and Russophobia. And Putin has since accused the Banderites and neo-Nazis of putting up heavy weapons and using human shields in Ukrainian cities. And this sort of rhetoric didn't stop even when the Russians shelled the memorial to Babyn Yar, the site where Nazis killed tens of thousands of Jews during the war. So Putin has weaponized this history of the Second World War. And indeed, even on the day that he invaded Ukraine, the television in Russia was just full of World War II movies and rhetoric and so on. So Putin longs to go into the history books as Vladimir the Great, emulating perhaps Peter the Great, but certainly with a tinge of Stalin. And he's using World War II, at least in part, to help make this happen.
Alex, thanks very much. There was so much there, and really look forward to talking with you a bit about some of these threads that you identified for us about Eastern Europe, about the present, about Russian nationalism, about Ukraine. Before that, though, we'd like then now to hear from Professor Omer Bartov. Omer, please.
Thank you. What I will try to do is raise a few questions regarding the manner in which history seems to be very present in contemporary politics, and particularly in the case of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. And I'll talk a little bit very briefly about some memory laws, and then move from there to other kind of wars, that is the kind of war that we are watching right now. And I think there is some interesting connections between them. This sort of struggle over competing historical narratives, the status of victims and perpetrators, of national heroes and internal or foreign villains, has actually become an increasingly prominent feature of the last few decades in Europe and elsewhere. But here we'll focus only on the case of Eastern Europe. It's often related to events that occurred in World War II, but in some cases it moves much further back, not least in Ukraine, the case of the Holodomor, the mass famine in Ukraine in 1931-32. Of course, in the case of Turkey, it goes back to World War I and the genocide of the Armenians, not yet acknowledged by the Turkish government. So I'll start with a visit that the former president of Ukraine, Yushenko, Viktor Yushenko, made to Israel in 2007. In 2006, the year before, Yushenko proposed a law that would recognize the Holodomor, this mass famine, as a genocide, as a Soviet genocide against the Ukrainian people. And during his visit to Israel the following year, he obviously hoped to have the state of Israel recognize the Holodomor as genocide. And it's interesting, why was it important to Yushenko that Israel recognized it as genocide? It was not recognized as such, partly because politicians in Israel, to quote one of them, said that many Ukrainians are among the righteous of the nations who risk their lives to save Jews, as we recently heard from Zelensky, from the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky. But the spokesperson said, we cannot accept the commemoration of the actions of Ukrainian individuals who, in the course of the national struggle for Ukrainian independence, took part in mass murder of Jews. So this is part of a problem of who are the heroes, the freedom fighters, the glorious national heroes, and who are those, who were engaged in genocide and other crimes. This goes back to a sort of back and forth between Poland and Ukraine, and Poland and its own past. So already in 1998, Poland legislated, in fact, the first memory law in Eastern Europe, which stipulated that anyone who publicly and contradicts the crimes mentioned in another article of that law would be subject to a fine or to a penalty. And those crimes were crimes against people of Polish nationality and other Polish citizens, including Nazi crimes, communist crimes, and other crimes against the peace, humanity, and war crimes. The law did not specifically speak about what occurred, of course, also on Polish soil during World War II, which was the genocide of the Jews. There is no direct reference to that, and in that there's an interesting sort of echo of Soviet ways of speaking about the Great Patriotic War, which talked about all Soviet, innocent Soviet citizens murdered by the Nazis or by the fascists, as they were called, without any particular reference to the Holocaust. But in 2018, the Polish Parliament passed an amendment to this Act of 1998. And what's interesting in this new version, it had two parts. One of them had to do, and that was the one that was better known publicly in the international debate over it, had to do with trying to criminalize anyone who spoke about Polish complicity in the Holocaust. That was eventually not criminalized, but rather became a civil crime. But the idea was that such allegations of Polish complicity in the Holocaust would besmirch the good name of Poland. But there was another part to it which referred to Ukraine. And here, this law spoke about crimes committed by Ukrainian nationalists and members of Ukrainian units collaborating with the Third Reich. And that those constituted acts by Ukrainian nationalists between 1925 and 1950. So it went way back in time before World War II. Now, the interesting thing is that this section of the Polish law actually referred to laws passed in Ukraine in 2015, just 3 years earlier, part of the law on the legal status and honoring the memory of the fighters for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century, which criminalized, although, again, eventually this was not criminalized, but only made into a civil offense, anyone who besmirches Ukrainian nationals, anyone who expresses disrespect for those such as fighters for Ukrainian independence, and the public denial of the legitimacy of the struggle for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century is deemed desecration of the memory of the fighters for Ukraine's independence in the 20th century. It's interesting because the point of contention between Poland and Ukraine are what used to be Eastern Poland. Those areas had a majority Ukrainian population. The Ukrainian population there did not want to be under Polish rule, as occurred in the interwar period. And during World War II, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army fought to liberate themselves of Polish rule, and in the course of that, conducted ethnic cleansing of the Polish population, as well as working together with the Germans to murder the Jews. So each side sees the same event from a very, very different perspective, and has tried actually to legislate about that. Now, all of this has now receded very quickly into the past again because of the current events. And I want to say a few words about the current events and how they relate to that. I think I have another 5 minutes left. So the current conflict is also, in many ways, a conflict over history. And as Alex said quite rightly, of course, already from Soviet times, from the very end of World War II, the Soviet Union and then Russia had a different chronology for World War II on all Soviet memorials. World War II began in 1941 until 1939, because between 1939 and 1941, the Soviet Union was in fact an ally of Nazi Germany, not something that anyone in the Soviet Union or now in Russia wants to remember. Now, as this war, the current war, began on February 26th, a Russian document came up on the internet and was quickly thereafter withdrawn because the war wasn't going too well. And what it spoke about was that the return to Russia of the great Russia. That is, that what the war was about was to recreate historical Russia, which is made of Great Russia, White Russia, Belarus, and Little Russia, Ukraine. Now, that is, in fact, the major central goal of this war, as I understand it, by Putin. It's not to return to the Soviet Union, it's to return to Imperial Russia and to its natural areas of rule and expansion. Now, in order to legitimize this attempt to take over an independent country, Putin referred to its denazification, and by that he evoked many of the memories that I was just speaking about, and managed to trigger a conversation which was based really on turning everything on its head. The term was related to the term itself goes back to German history. It's really the attempt to denazify Germany during its occupation in the immediate aftermath of World War II. But in the minds of many Russians, it links to a long-term view of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, as holding Russian society together under a myth of unity and of enemies. And it evokes memories of that World War II collaboration with the Nazis. Now, Ukraine, as Alex has said, of course, has been going through a difficult process of coming to terms with its past, not only of modernizing itself as a society and becoming increasingly democratic, but also of trying to face up to that past. This is not an easy process, and it has not been easy for any country, including France, Germany, Austria, many others that we can talk about. But of course, in Ukraine, this began only in 1991. That is when Ukraine became independent and therefore could divorce itself from the Soviet narrative of things that was not at all interested in evoking memories of collaboration. And it obscures, of course, also the role of Ukraine as an example of possible democracy right on Russia's doorstep, and in fact, in a part that of this world that in Putin's consciousness is really a natural part of Russia, and therefore shows that Russia can actually become democratic. Now, I'll just say one last word, and that is about the Ukrainian view of this. We can talk much more about it, but within the Ukrainian national narrative, the war that is occurring now is part of a long struggle for Ukrainian independence that goes back to the mid-17th century, to the Cossack uprising, and then to the creation of what is seen historically. It's not exactly correct, but in the historical memory, as the first independent Ukrainian state, that is the Cossack state, that was by the end of the 17th century taken over by what became the Russian Empire. At the time, it was not even Russia; it was Muscovy. It became the Russian Empire only in the 18th century, and so for Ukraine, what is happening now is really part of a 300-year-long struggle to divorce itself from Russia on the one hand and from Poland, and we can talk about it later, on the other. And I'll stop here, and I hope we'll have an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Omer, thank you very much for that excellent commentary. What I'd like to do now is just pose some general questions and kind of follow up on some things that both of you have mentioned. And where I'd like to begin, this is really one for both of you, and I'll just kind of rotate order of who can go first. So Omer, we'll hear from you first and then from Alex. But both of you really talked about political pressure on the teaching of history and the way that politics is shaping narratives of the past, not least of which World War II in Eastern Europe. Obviously, Russia has been getting most of the attention, but Alex also talked about the Law and Justice Party in Poland. We could mention Viktor Orban in Hungary. There could be other cases we could bring up. I guess what I wanted to hear from both of you about here is for our audience to not think that this was simply an inevitable onslaught in terms of how narratives are being consciously reshaped by politicians, that people have fought back against these trends, that people have really contested these pressures. So could each of you say something about how that has happened in Eastern Europe in the last 2 decades or so, where whether individuals or organizations, whether universities or institutions have really pushed for a more open, critical approach to their own history and the history of that region? Omer first, and then Alex.
Sure, this is a major question. I would say that we can really, when we speak about this, we have to go back to the fall of communism in Eastern Europe and the collapse of the Soviet Union. This is the starting point, because between the end of World War II and the fall of communism, all the countries that we're talking about, including, of course, Hungary and Poland and Ukraine, have to conform to a particular narrative of the past. And that narrative of the past is, at least in the sense of World War II, that there was an anti-fascist struggle and that communism won over fascism. And the heroes of that were the anti-fascists and those who sacrificed themselves to rid the world of Hitler. What one could not talk about was about the national histories of those countries, and the fact that for many of those countries, and that includes parts of Ukraine, certainly West Ukraine, certainly Poland, the liberation of those countries from German Nazi rule was followed by what they saw as a reoccupation by the Soviets and the installation of communist dictatorships. So once that is over, one can start talking again about the past. And there are two narratives of that past. One is that now we can go back to democracy, we can liberalize our countries. There is a strong urge, of course, to join the EU, to install democracies. The other is that now we can resurrect also our own national heroes, precisely those who did indeed often either collaborate with the Nazis or at least support nationalist causes. And nationalist causes often talk not only about one's own nation, but also about that nation's enemies. And so as I try to indicate, say, in the Polish memory laws, they were both about crimes against the Polish nation under the Soviets, under communist rule, and crimes against the Polish nation by the Nazis. And there was often a tension between the two. Poland was the first to create an institute for national memory that was followed also by Ukraine and other countries. And those institutes had to sort of rewrite and or clean up these two narratives. And so in that sense, what we see today and what we were talking about before the Russian invasion of Ukraine was also that there was a trend back to the right, both in Hungary, in Poland, in some Baltic states, and that is an internal struggle. And then you had Russia move into that and change, at least temporarily, change the narrative.
Thank you. Alex, please.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating how what is going to happen because of this war, because everything we might have said a month ago might be completely different. Or, as you say, it may go back in 2 years' time. It's the same sort of struggles between the Poles and the Ukrainians or whatever. But at the moment, we just don't know how it's going to change this narrative. I would say that, generally speaking, having spent that time, so from 1989 to and spending the mid 90s in Russia, going back and forth between Oxford and Russia and in Ukraine and in Poland. And there was this tremendous sort of burst of optimism, openness, an attempt to get into the archives, to really examine history. A lot of young scholars who felt sort of liberated. In places like Poland, there had always been this kind of underground history. The Poles never took the Soviet line too seriously. They had to officially if they were publishing under the official publishing houses and so on. But I remember the difference between East Germany, which was so tightly constricted in the 1980s, and Poland, where people just wrote and said pretty well what they wanted, as long as it wasn't official. But there was this sort of outpouring of optimism and looking at history. And again, having spent those 90s years in Yeltsin's Russia, it was amazing because Yeltsin had lots of problems and he was an alcoholic and he made huge mistakes with the economy and created the oligarchs and everything. But one thing he was a Democrat. He believed in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and all of those things. And he threw open the archives. And it was amazing, amazing time to be able to go in and just pretty well look at anything you wanted to. That, of course, ended with Putin. So I think one of the things was that sort of pendulum swing to this optimistic openness about the past, with, of course, caveats. And then it's come back. And as Omer was saying, that this sort of right-wing kind of tendencies of nationalism, this attempt to make the past fit your box of your national vision of your history, which usually means being nasty about your neighbors one way or another. And particularly in this part of the world where borders have crossed, populations are mixed. I mean, you can't, there's no line between Ukraine and Poland historically. They're all mixed. One of the problems with Donbass is it's mixed populations, and that's just the reality of the post-World War I settlements after the dissolution of the empires. So I think, yes, there was a sort of huge period of optimism and then a much more sort of cynical manipulation of history, Poland being a prime example.
Thank you very much. I wanted just to follow that up with Omer mentioned that in Ukrainian narratives about independence and the striving for autonomy, that these reach back to the 17th century. And obviously here we've been foregrounding the Second World War, and understandably so, given how transformative and devastating that war was for Eastern Europe. I wanted to ask, though, just maybe to play devil's advocate here, if we are looking at Eastern Europe and these narratives, nationalist or otherwise, should we go back prior to World War II? And how far back should we go if we want to understand something about, for example, desires for independence in Ukraine or Poland? I think for a lot of Americans, this is a history that's deeply unfamiliar and feel very insecure about who to believe and where to go to. So just one example I would note is that when Putin gave a speech last month, where he glorified Stalin along the lines that Alex was mentioning, but he talked about Lenin as the father of Ukrainian independence. And it was a statement, I think, that caused a lot of consternation about what is he really getting at here. And it was obviously raising issues about World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution and the Russian Civil War, et cetera, a history that is very complicated, to say the least. So I guess what I wanted to ask here, if we're really trying to make sense of this history, obviously World War II will be central to that. How far back do you think we should go if we're really wanting to understand it? Alex, we'll start with you and then Omer on this one.
Well, unfortunately, if you really want to sort of understand what's going on between between Ukraine and Russia, you have to go back to the 900s, if not before, when the Vikings were trying to create trade routes going through what is now Ukraine, and created Kievan Rus, which is this sort of kernel of what became actually in the early Middle Ages one of, if not the most important, powerful sort of areas in Europe. It was hugely influential and powerful and important until it was sacked in the 13th century. But this is the sort of this kernel of history which the Russians keep going on about, because the Ukrainians can look back to Kiev and say, well, we've been here since, well, actually before 900, and it's a continuous presence. This is our country, our culture, and our identity. And yes, indeed, the Ukrainians have had enormous struggles trying to create a nation state. There have been all sorts of reasons for it. Omer was talking about, the problems with Poles, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Lithuanians, and also problems with Muscovy, and choices that the Ukrainians made going with Muscovy, which ended up with them being subjugated by the Russians. Then they were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's one of the most complex histories to unravel. But in terms of using this history, in terms of manipulating it, the Ukrainians can say, this is the kernel. Kiev is the place where we started. This is where we began. The trouble is that the Russians also claim that that's where they began, and so they consider Kiev to be their roots as well. And this is why you had the situation, for example, someone like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, when the Soviet Union was breaking up, and he said, well, okay, they can have the Baltic states. I mean, this great writer, author of Gulag Archipelago, you'd think he'd stand for all these human freedoms and so on. Baltic states can go, and the Caucasus can go, and they're colonies. We don't need them, but you can. We have to fight to keep Ukraine. We have to fight to keep Belarus, because this is the true Russia. And with this kind of conflict, and a conflict over history and over the reading of history, the interpretation of history, it's very, very difficult to see how there will be a solution.
Thank you. Omer?
Yeah, so first of all, as a historian, of course, I think that history matters a great deal. And it's true that for Americans, and I think not a few West Europeans too, it's very difficult to get a grasp of the very complex history, as Alex was indicating, of that region. But I'd say that if we are to understand what lies at the core of many of these conflicts, apart from the contemporary politics and interests and the memory of World War II, which is huge and important, and certainly in Russia plays a huge role, but also in much of Eastern Europe for reasons that I indicated, not just the war, but everything that came after that. If we are to understand how people view themselves, we need to go much further back in history. And here what I would say is that it's not just that history matters to many people involved in what we see now between Ukraine and Russia, but that history is read completely differently. And that it's this, it makes you understand that history is not simply telling what happened in the past, but how a national history is created and internalized by generations of people who believe this to be a major component of their existence, of their identity. And I'll just give a couple of examples. I mentioned the Free Cossack state. I mean, it was not really a Ukrainian state, and the Cossacks and Ukrainians are not the same thing, but that it doesn't matter. In the histories and novels written in the 19th century, the 17th century was then related to readers of those popular books as the beginning of nationalism, the beginning of Ukrainian nationalism. The main figure in the Cossack uprising is Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And Khmelnytsky is a major Ukrainian national hero. In other stories, Khmelnytsky is the scourge of the Jews and the Poles. For traditional Jews living in Ukraine in the late 19th century, first half of the 20th century, the word Khmelnytsky meant pogrom, because the Cossack uprising included major slaughters of Jews and Poles in what is now Ukraine. So the same figure has very different meanings in different historical memories. The same would go to the next Ukrainian national hero of the second attempt to create an independent Ukrainian state, and that's Petlura, who was a national Ukrainian hero, tried to create an independent Ukrainian state, and that state was then could not survive under the Bolshevik onslaught, and became part of the Soviet Union. And the same goes certainly in West Ukraine to the man who was head of the more radical faction of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Stepan Bandera, who is commemorated everywhere in West Ukraine and remembered as having fought both against the Poles in the 1930s, Polish rule in the 1930s, and the insurgency against the Soviets that continued long after the end of World War II into the late 1940s. But Bandera and the Banderites, Banderovci, Banderivci, his followers were involved in killing Jews and Poles. So again, a very different collective memory that matters to this day. And if we talk about Putin, when you think about it, who are Putin's examples? I don't think that Putin wants to go back to Lenin. I don't think he wants to recreate communism. But he has heroes. One of them is Stalin, and Stalin, of course, under Putin, has become a national hero again in Russia, and there's major suppression of the actual history of Stalin the butcher, the murder of millions of Soviet citizens, and a memory of him as the hero of World War II, as having defeated Stalin, and under him he made Russia great again. He made a great Soviet Union. All these acquisitions of territory in Eastern Europe after World War II. If we go back from that, it would be Peter the Great and Ivan the Terrible. These would be the sort of heroes who created Great Russia, which in the kind of historical narrative that Putin is trying not only to inculcate in his population, but also to realize these are the heroes. And that's why, if we try to think about it from a political perspective, a current political perspective, we have to understand that Ukraine naturally, in his eyes, and much of the Russian population belongs to Russia. But beyond that, that there are many other parts of Europe that should be under Russian sphere of influence. And those include the Baltic countries. Those include, of course, areas like Transnistria, the historical fear of Poland, and a kind of association, and that's interesting to see, also between Russia and the Southern Slavs in the Balkans. So the vision is a much greater vision, and Putin will try to realize it if he's allowed to.
I appreciate you both answering that question. I know there's so much there to compress in a few minutes, but I think just even hearing that will really benefit our audience. I wanted to, just looking at my remaining time, I think I've got about 10 minutes or so with you before we turn it back over to Mike for the audience's questions. This next one I wanted to ask is about Putin and about his kind of great Russian nationalism and his attempt to appropriate the history of World War II to justify the invasion. And this is really for both of you, and we'll hear from Omer first this time, is how successful do you think he's been with the Russian population? Here in the United States, the U.S. press has, of course, covered what's happened with protests against the war in Russia. Several thousand people having been arrested, the prison sentence for Novotny, etc. We've seen a great deal about this, these moves, and Alex alluded to it in her commentary. But here I want to ask is, how successful has this really been in terms of saying to Russians that this war is necessary, that this is a kind of inheritor conflict to World War II? It is about denazifying Ukraine. We have fascists on our doorstep. That's the rhetoric that Putin has been using. Is to ask is how much success has he really had in making his case to the Russian people?
I think we don't entirely know. It's very hard to know when you speak about a country in which reporting about public opinion is highly limited, and increasingly so. I think that the general view, from my understanding, is that Putin has been much more successful in those parts of Russia that have, in fact, been left behind. That is less successful in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which became sort of look much more like modern advanced cities with a flourishing middle class, much westernized, connected to social media, that sees itself in many ways as part of the rest of Europe. And if you drive 10, 20, 100 kilometers out of there, then you end up in a very different kind of Russia. And in that Russia, which still adheres very closely to the narrative of the Great Patriotic War, which watches mostly Russian television, is not well connected to social media. If you continue telling these stories on the news channels, then obviously there is much more support for his regime and for his narrative. It's a bit more complicated than that, though, I would say, for a number of reasons. First of all, I'd say what we see happening now, that is numerous indications of demoralization in the Russian army. Why is that happening? Well, because Putin wanted to sell his war and didn't want to sell his war at the same time. That is, he wanted to say, oh, it's just a special military operations. We are just going to cleanse Ukraine of all those fascists who are oppressing the Ukrainians. And once we do that, then of course they'll join us, because it's just the fascists there who don't want to be part of great Russia. But when you do that, it means that you cannot have the kind of propaganda that would sell the war to the soldiers and to everyone else. So I think that that has been a kind of conundrum for the Russian regime. On the other hand, I would say that the same groups of people that are less supportive of the war and now less supportive of Putin, and of whom thousands have now left Russia and gone to Yerevan, to Tbilisi, to Istanbul, because they don't feel that the Russia that is emerging will be to their taste. Those were the people that Putin actually bought and brought together by allowing them, after the turbulence of the Yeltsin era, to become an affluent, comfortable middle class in nice apartments, with iPhones, with travel to around the world. And so they were not that opposed to the regime, and as many Ukrainians would say, in 2014, when the Russians invaded East Ukraine, they said nothing. Now, now they will suffer in many ways more than anyone else, because they, before that, were the beneficiaries. So I think it's a mixed picture, but clearly the regime has not been able to sell this war as successfully as it would like, and I think things are going to get worse in the next few weeks.
Thank you, Omer. Alex?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we don't really know. when I was living in Russia, I was there in the Yeltsin years. There was this sort of young, up-and-coming, new middle class who'd gone to Harvard or somewhere, and they'd come back and they were going to be bankers or whatever else. So they were, this sort of aspiring middle class and doing quite well. And in that period, that we could talk about anything. There was no censorship of any kind. But despite everything else and all the sort of looking toward the West and having links with the West and everything else, I didn't meet one single person the whole time I was there, a Russian, who believed that Ukraine should be an independent state. It's just so deeply ingrained in the Russian mentality, so that even the sophisticated young men and women in the cities still believe that this is so. It's rather like if you said that, I don't know, Washington State should no longer be part of the states. That's somehow how they feel about it. But that's one question. That's that historical perspective. But another question is the experience that we had, for example, with Russian mothers when the body bags started coming back from Grozny or Afghanistan or wherever. And there is some hope that nothing to do with historiography, but that to do with the fact that this is a war that's not going well. It's not what Putin expected, and his. Obviously, the military is very demoralized, as Omer was saying, and the young men who were sent there, calling home to their mothers saying, "I didn't even know what I was doing here. I thought we were on some sort of maneuvers," and so on. And so, if that increases, in other words, if the failure continues to be as bad as it seems to be, and the body count starts to mount up, it's possible that there will be demonstrations, as there were before in Moscow, Petersburg, and elsewhere, as Omer says, not so much out in the countryside. And another thing to remember is that Putin is ex-KGB, lieutenant colonel. Lieutenant colonel meaning he didn't get very far in his career. He's not a particularly imaginative or interesting thinker or person in that effect. He's sort of a mediocre career, went back to Petersburg to make lots of money, and actually stumbled into rather getting Yeltsin to he manipulated it very cleverly, but he also was very, very lucky. And he's not a particularly thoughtful, interesting, insightful man. He's KGB through and through, FSB, and one of the first things he's done and did was to control the media. There's no free press anymore. Even Rain Television has shut down. The free newspapers and other media outlets have gone. And so, with the exception of that sort of urban class with their cell phones and stuff like that, who can talk to one another, out in the countryside, the only information they get is Russian TV, which has Putin on it every day, all the time. You can't move without seeing him doing something, opening something, greeting somebody, whatever it is. And so these people are really, really convinced by the propaganda. So I think the hope, if there's any hope for any kind of general upsurge against him, it would be because the war is going badly, not because of that he's lost control of the media or because of historiography.
Yeah, can I add just one word?
Please, please.
Because I think that is an important point. My sense too is that Putin, if anybody's hoping that Putin will be removed because there are protests against the war, I don't think that will happen. They can put 10,000 people in jail or 100,000 people in jail. Russia is a big country. I think that the only prospect of a regime change in Russia would be if the small elites around Putin himself believe that he is really taking Russia on the wrong path. But as one former Russian foreign minister said, in Russia historically, and this is where history comes in, you don't come to the boss and give him bad news. You either don't give the bad news or you come to the boss with a weapon. And then you either lead him to the cemetery or to early retirement. And the thing is, I think, that people around Putin will be afraid not only of removing him, but also who will come after him without there being a bloodbath in the Kremlin.
That's
if I could just add,
yes,
it's also very interesting it's again, everybody hoped that Hitler in the bunker would be assassinated and this little awful corporal, and that they would get together and do it. It just doesn't happen. And you're absolutely right, Omer, that the clique around Putin has been so carefully handpicked by him, and they don't say anything that he doesn't want to hear. And also, you must have been to the Kremlin. I mean, it is like a sort of vast prison. I mean, it's very, very difficult to get in and out of there if you're not invited. Let's put it that way. And it's so physically very, very controlled, and it reminds me a little bit of the death of Stalin, when when everybody was so frightened to go because they all knew that he was creating this sort of this doctor's plot, and they knew that a lot of them knew they were going to be for the chop, and yet not one single one, despite all the rumors to the contrary, not one single one actually had the gumption to actually kill him. He collapsed, and they let him be. But so unless Putin has some sort of strange medical condition, of which there's been speculation as well, I think that the idea that there's going to be either a palace coup or, as you rightly say, the Russians have never been shy of putting tens and tens and tens of thousands of people in prison or worse. And that's a tradition that Putin very much believes in. So I don't think that's the way it's going to go. There still may be protests, however.
Well, I want to thank you both for an outstanding conversation. There's so many more things I would like to ask you, but I think our audience would also like to have an opportunity to interact with you. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Mike Bell, who will handle the Q&A for the remainder of the session.
Well, thanks, Jason, and thanks for our panelists. The first question is really about new directions in scholarship. What new directions do you think scholars will take about World War II because of the contemporary crisis in Ukraine?
Alex, you want to take that?
Okay. Well, first of all, when something like this happens, and it's a pattern that's repeated itself, throughout history. So, for example, when all of a sudden, there's war in the Middle East, and all of a sudden, they realize that, Washington realizes there are no Arabic speakers, and oops, we better get onto this, or whatever it might be. When there's a war, when there's a conflict like this, when something like this flares up, all of a sudden people become interested, rightly so. We might be looking down the abyss of World War III if we're very unlucky. So this part of the world, it's always mattered. It's always been interesting. It's always been crucial to Europe. It's always been crucial to Russia, to the Soviet Union. But, it was behind the Iron Curtain and out of sight, out of mind. And then it had a strange history with Russia. And so it's rather been left aside, except for some, very interesting scholars. But I think now the complexity of Ukraine's history and its meaning and why it's important is going to be valued more. And I suspect that the Ukrainian Center at Harvard or all the other places that have Ukrainian scholars and libraries and so on are going to start to see an upsurge of interest.
Excellent.
Yeah, I just add that. First of all, I teach European history at an American university, and as many people know, European history, or modern European history in particular, has been under attack within history departments in the United States, not in Europe, but in the United States. And I think that what we see now reminds us how important it is for us to actually know European history if we want to know the world that we live in. Specifically for Ukraine, I must say that this has been a huge change, because most people in this country didn't really even know where Ukraine was or what it was. And this is a lesson in Ukrainian history, which is, as we've been saying throughout this hour, a very complicated history. So I do believe that this will make a difference. How long? That's hard to say, because certainly in scholarship, things move very quickly from one interest to another.
Yeah, while we're waiting for the next question to come up, do you think there'll be more interest in what had been seen as kind of traditional history, political history, history of statecraft or wars, as opposed to the social history because of this?
No, absolutely. It's very interesting because I've always specialized in, first of all, Central European history, where people say, why are you interested in that? And then World War II history, and there's been an equally mystified question. And all of a sudden, I'm getting calls and emails and whatever from people saying, what's going on here? What about this? What about that? What are these weapons? Because I also do NATO defense and security studies here at my university, and people all of a sudden want to know, well, what kind of tank? How many tanks do we have in Europe and all this kind of stuff? Nobody cared before. Absolutely no interest whatsoever. And I had a summer school for the World War II Museum called Between Hitler and Stalin, and took students up to the Baltops, Baltic maneuvers on the Baltic for NATO and this kind of thing. And people sort of bafflingly ask, why are you interested in this? Well, all of a sudden we have our answer. We were living in a sort of sense of false security. And all of a sudden we are at war. We, meaning the world, is facing a war. And as I said, it hopefully won't spread, but it may. And all of a sudden it becomes an existential threat to Ukraine and possibly even to some of the rest of us.
Omer?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. First of all, on the military side of it, I started as a military historian, and military history has not been exactly at the forefront of historians in the last few decades. And I've been seeing exactly the same thing, including many commentators who don't really know the military history of World War II, don't know much about militaries or weapons anyway, and suddenly they have to find out. So, yeah, I think there will be an interest in that. I would add one more thing. For many years in scholarship, but also generally in sort of more in academic circles, there has been this idea that nationalism, patriotism, all those old ideas were behind us. Europe would be just Europe, and patriotism was something that our grandfathers did in the world wars, or fathers in my case. And I think that what we see now, first of all, in Ukraine, is extraordinary in the sense that you are seeing live real patriotism, people fighting for their own country and believing that it is important to do so, and the rest of the world watching it in awe rather than cynically. And that has to do also, of course, with the power of nationalism, that people believe that the nation, as they define it, has a right to exist and must be defended. And that may have a long-term influence. There could be negative sides to it as well, of course, as there have been always in the case of nationalism. But I think at least as historians, we have to recognize the centrality of these ideas at the present time.
Well, thank you.
I agree.
Oh, go ahead, please, Alex.
Just to briefly add a quick comment that about 20% of my students here are Ukrainian, and I've been absolutely amazed because everybody was saying, "Oh, snowflake generation," and they don't do anything, and ha ha. And these students, and there's one young man in particular who had bought an apartment flat here in Warsaw, which his parents had helped him to buy, and he had student right to stay here and everything else. He sold his flat when the invasion started, so that he could finance himself to go back and fight. And my students aren't at my class anymore because they're fighting. I am completely amazed at this. And it's just unbelievable.
No, thank you. And the next one is probably related to this nationalist narrative. What can historians do when to preserve history when governments restrict the narrative? And Alex, we could start with you and then move to Omer on this.
Well, first of all, it's no longer, it depends where you live. Obviously, if you live in a place like Russia, where it becomes a criminal offense to even, say anything rude about Stalin, it becomes dangerous. But the thing is, the world is changing. And so for most of us, even if there are restrictions on history with this Polish Holocaust law or whatever it might be, my view is publish and be damned. If you've got unless you live in a place where you're going to go to prison, then maybe you should move or publish in a different way or publish it under a different name or whatever else. And I had my father-in-law was imprisoned by the Germans and then by the Stalinists. When he got out, he kept publishing and publishing and publishing, illegal papers about Katyn. Then he'd lose his job at whatever paper. Then he'd go and publish something else about the victims of Stalinism. But then he'd lose that job, and then he was back in prison, and this and that. If you want to get the information out, if you have the courage and the determination, even in the most vile system, you can do it. And most of us are fortunate enough not to live in that sort of system. I think you need to always keep in mind to write the truth. I mean, the truth, whatever that means, but using sources, going to history sources and being as absolutely truthful. Warts in all history, however unpleasant it might be for the regime, however unpleasant it might be for your personal history or whatever it is, to go and be absolutely scrupulously honest and publish and be down unless you're about to lose your life for it.
Omer?
Yeah, I of course agree. I'd say that, look, I mean, as historians, we obviously believe that history is important. I think that if we try to understand the last 2 centuries, the 19th and the 20th centuries, were centuries in which history came to play an increasingly important role. First of all, it emerged as a historical discipline, and it came to play an increasingly important role in how people understood their place in the world and their place in their community, in their society, in their state, in their nation. And so, in that sense, history was always also complicit in nationalist narratives. And historians played a huge role also in creating, I'd say, pernicious histories. So that is one side of it. History can actually tell you a particular story that conforms with what your regime wants you to think. And that can be incorporated in school curricula. It can be part of the media. And you're telling your people a history. It has many true elements to it. But at the same time, it is a particular kind of history. And usually that history has both friends and foes. The other side of it, and the important one, is that as historians, we always have to both believe in the power and importance of knowing the past, and at the same time to go against the myths and mythologies and lies and these kind of pernicious histories that make people believe in a kind of national narrative that sets them apart. And every nation, of course, has its own special path, believes that it's the most important, that its existence is the most important. Just now, yesterday, I think Putin was saying that now the West is trying to cancel Russian history, that 1,000-year-old history. So in that sense, as historians, we must first say that history is crucial to understanding who you are, where you came from, and therefore possibly where you're going. And at the same time, that you always have to look at it critically. You cannot take anything at face value.
Now, that leads us into a segue in our next question. Omer, you'll get this one first, and then Alex. But as we think about these dueling narratives, as we compare and contrast, the Great Patriotic War and the Good War, how do you see that Russia's World War II narrative compares and contrasts with the World War II Good War mythology?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think that in Russia, the Great Patriotic War plays a much more central role in political, first of all, just in people's sense of themselves and of their history, but also in political manipulation than in the United States. I think in the United States, a certain view of World War II was created over time. I don't think it was there right at the beginning, right at the end of World War II, but was created as the Good War. Was obviously never good, and the best thing about war is how to avoid it. But a sense that there was a time in which America fought for democracy, fought against tyranny and totalitarianism, a time in which society mobilized, that everyone was on the same page, and that is a unifying memory. The case of Russia is different because the Soviet Union was invaded by over 3 million German and Allied soldiers and devastated. And the Soviet Union suffered up to possibly 28 million lives, the majority of whom were civilians, although also millions of soldiers. And so it's also a highly traumatic memory, which I don't think is the case of the good war. The good war is a kind of good memory. So that Russian, Soviet, and then Russian story of sacrifice, of victimhood, and then of winning the war against evil, against Nazism, is a complicated one. And we have to remember that the price that the Soviet Union paid was a price for generations. It wasn't just that the war was very costly. The economic devastation, the demographic effects of the war. If you just think of the millions of orphans, the effect on an entire generation of children was huge. And so, in that sense, I think it's a much heavier load to carry as a historical memory, and it's one that can be manipulated more effectively to justify the unjustifiable, precisely because it's so traumatic. And I'd say one last thing. I come from Israel. I was raised in Israel, and part of the burden of being there is the memory of the Holocaust. And that's not equivalent to the Great Patriotic War, but it's, of course, also a deeply traumatic, nationalized memory. And such memories can be unifying and can also be used to justify what should not be justified as one sense of a fight for existence, that you can do what otherwise would not be allowed because you have once almost been entirely destroyed.
Those are important insights. Alex, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. The Great Patriotic War really was a horrific conflict. 26, we'll never know the exact number of people who died on what we call the Eastern Front. Deprivations and privations, murder, bestiality, the young soldiers, being sent out to die. These are absolutely dreadful things. But the thing that I object to with the way in which the war is portrayed in Russia now is that all those things are true, and I don't know anybody who would say, these poor young guys are dying and so on. It's terrible. But it's the way in which the rest of the history is manipulated. That Poland started the war, that the Finnish war never happened, the Winter War never happened. And also the aims of the Soviet Union, of Stalin, both during and after the war, he was always fighting not just a military but also a political war with the aim of creating this sort of buffer zone or sphere of influence in which the peoples he was taking over were never to have the freedoms that they fought for, particularly the Poles, but others as well. Whereas I must say that the narrative in the United States, which was always much more careful about its troops, it was always trying to preserve the lives of its own citizens, no race to Berlin because there may be casualties. You drop the bomb on Hiroshima because there may be American casualties if you don't. It was a different kind of calculation and much more respect for individual human life. It's a different society, different culture, different concept of what that means. And in a sense, if you were talking about, which one of those is a good war, well, yes, good in both senses that we're trying to fight Hitler. But I would say that it does matter what you're fighting for in the end. It's not just to get rid of Hitler. It's also what kind of society do you want to put in place afterwards? And we, on our side, if you will, had things like the Atlantic Charter and creation of the United Nations and the decision to allow Germany to or at least Western Germany, to thrive and become part of the Western economic community and military, eventually NATO and everything else. Whereas Stalin's idea was to punish, take reparations, keep the boot down, and not just on Germany, although that was the prime target, but also on countries like Poland that had actually helped to fight against Hitler. So I think that also must play a role as to what your aim or ambition is, as well as the actual sacrifice of the soldiers on the ground.
I just want to jump in for 1 sec, because I completely agree with Alex. I just want to add that, I think I mentioned it someplace. There was a TV show a good 20, 25 years ago about the Eastern Front, and it had different names. In Russia, it was called the Great Patriotic War. In Germany, it was called the Unforgettable War, and in America, it was called the Unknown War. And that tells us something. I think that what I think many Russians have felt rightly is that there was a kind of Western narrative that we all together won the war against Nazi Germany. And there was really very little knowledge about the nature of the Eastern Front, the war on the East. When I did my PhD examination, my Viva Voce, one of my examiners was Sir Michael Howard, who was then Regius Professor of History at Oxford. And he had been an officer in an armored brigade on the Western Front. And when he read my dissertation, which was on the war in the East, he said, we fought against the same Panzer division for months. And when we caught some of their officers, we treated them nicely. We'd have a drink with them. There was an air of chivalry, and the same on the other side. And he said, I had no idea that things looked the way you described them on the Eastern Front. So in that sense, I think, first, there were really two wars being fought, and one was the war that Americans remembered and the British, and it had many aspects of being a good war. And the other was something that was entirely different, totally barbarous. And that the sacrifice, including, of course, the battle on Berlin, the sacrifice of the Red Army, I think was not recognized in Western historiography, including military history, for decades to come.
No, those are important. Go ahead, Alex.
I completely agree that that's one of the things that I think that really, in order to understand the world that Putin's living in, the world that we are now living in as well, we really do need to understand what happened out here. And I've been beating this drum for a very long time at the World War II Museum and everywhere else I can, and that to really understand, and also the psychological scars here. And by the way, not just of the war, which was horrific, unbelievable sometimes. And I'm sure, Omer, you've had the same experience. You sometimes just have to go and go for a walk and get some fresh air because of some of the things you're reading are just so horrific. But it's also the Soviet history out here as well, which it's the post-war settlement and those countries which ended up behind the Iron Curtain, and all of the baggage that's also brought, so that you have, for example, we were talking earlier about the Holocaust, Omer, that for us in the West, it's now become really, if you talk about the World War II, especially in Europe, the Holocaust is like the prime subject. But if you go to some of the memorials or museums in places like, I don't know, Lithuania or wherever, you find that the museum to totalitarianism is not about the Nazis at all, but is about the Stalinists. And that's something that, again, there's this huge blind spot in the West about the complexities and the layers and layers of how people feel here about their both wartime, well, I'd say World War I experience is totally unknown, interwar experience, Bolshevik revolution, the Civil War, the Polish Soviet War, the Second World War, and then the Soviet takeover. There needs to be an awful lot more work done on it.
Well, your point about how people feel, I'm going to ask you each how you feel here, and Alex, we'll go to you first, but is it dispiriting as historians to see history in the 21st century so clearly hijacked for another war in the region? Alex?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, as I was saying earlier, I think as historians we need to try and be completely honest about history. And I think that a great deal of that has to do with debunking myths that were created here very largely starting in the 19th century precisely because this part of the world was under imperial powers, under the Germans, Russians, Prussians or Germans, and Austro-Hungarians. And then when the First World War happened, the unthinkable happened. All these countries were recreated. They went back to these sort of myths, fake foundation myths. I mean, including Germany. I mean, Omer was talking about the complicity of historians going back into the 19th century. It wasn't just in Poland or Ukraine. It was the trend. And so these are the myths that we must debunk and we must look at, and a lot of governments and patriots don't like it. But I think it's extremely important. And so I would say, it's not surprising, but as historians, you accept that it's going to happen, but you try and work against it as much as possible.
Good. Omer?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised at all. I mean, it's always been the case. History has always been, as I was trying to say, both a real attempt to understand what happened in the past and a discipline that has been mobilized often to tell a particular story and to distort it in a way that serves what is seen as a regime or a national or an ideological interest. There was a French scholar in the 1920s who wrote about the treason of the intellectuals, Julia Bendin, and we, I think, as historians, actually have to always understand that and have to know that, quite apart from, I think, what drives us as historians, which is to understand, to know the past in all its complexity, to also know that what we say, what we write, can, so to speak, be used against us. And therefore, when we see that, if we have a particular authority as scholars to expose the kind of lies about history that are being espoused by this or that regime or leader, and that perhaps is the most important task that we actually face today as in the past.
Well, that leads in. We've got time for one more question, but as you think about that role, does one particular media, social, print, news, really carry the bulk of this struggle for historical memory in Poland and Ukraine today? And Omer, we can start with you. How's that?
It's hard to say these days which part of the media, and there's also, I think, the question is a little bit the scale. So obviously, in terms of the immediate effect that comes from social media, anything that is circulating around the internet, I think, then television, radio, the more traditional media. I think in the long run that there are what actually matters are other things. In the long run, I really believe what matters in knowing and understanding the past and knowing and understanding the deeper historical origins of what we see today. That we find in books, that we find in teaching, in school curricula, that we find in more intellectual debates. And so I would say that we have to distinguish between the sort of immediate effect, the sort of instant gratification that you get from your Twitter, and the deeper knowledge, including, of course, when it's manipulated by states of the past.
Alex, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's the whole range of things. I mean, immediate is social media, but it's transitory. So, how much will we be able to use in 50 years' time as historians? All that just goes into the ether. And so I think so. For example, just an example that I'm working with a friend of mine in London who's a lawyer who's they're interested in getting together materials to document possible war crimes trials and so on. And I think that this is the sort of thing that where you need to go and you need to get documentary evidence, proof, photographs, testimonies that are signed, all these sorts of things. These are the things that we have. For example, when I was working on the Warsaw Uprising book, you have these amazing documents, testimonies of people who were interviewed immediately after the war, officially or by the Red Cross, whatever. What happened to you? What did you see? They sign it. It's an official document, which is an eyewitness testimony, which you then have at least some sense that it's valid. It's not just been made up by somebody or whatever else. So I think there's a whole range of things we can do. Just as another note, I'm really surprised at how, and this is my technological uselessness coming through, but how little we've been able to infiltrate what's going on in Russia. We talked earlier about the fact that they get their news through Russian TV, but where are our, where's the amazing technology that could just flood the place with images and information about this? This is my question to the techno people out there.
So a great provocative panel. Thank you, our chair Jason, and our panelists Omer and Alex. Also the audience. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but they posed some great questions for you. Again, just a quick thanks to our sponsors of our Memory War Conference, the ABMC, American Battle Monuments Commission, EA, Respawn Entertainment, and Oculus by Meta. And thanks again to our presenters,